to contemplate how one could go into those sort of dark places. When I was asked to explain these sort of things, and often I was asked to explain these sort of things, and frankly I'm quite unqualified to give an explanation, my best guess was, and I realize I'm reflecting my bias, but my best guess was this is an illustration of what can happen to you when you take God completely out of your life, and there's no restraint from what your belief in God is going to allow you to do, and so you can do anything that you want to do. But when I got to the study of his sanity, the issue of his sanity, and the conclusion was that he was not an insane man, that he committed these things while perfectly sane. A lot of people have a hard time understanding that. If he was sane doing that, then what about me? What about you? What about I? Am I capable of some of the things that he was doing? Well, obviously, yes, very much so. There's no limit to how far we can dip into evil when there's no place for God in our lives. So I've often tried to explain his behavior as an example of what can happen to someone where there's no restraint of God. As we looked at the scripture last night, when you completely take God out of the picture, God will give you over to the conclusion that leads itself to, and I think that illustrates what happened with Jeffrey Dahmer. But Jeffrey Dahmer came to faith, and of course that in itself is something of a mystery. How did that come about? The final answer as to how it all came about would not be known to me until after his death, and I had a chance to talk to his father, Lionel. When I was visiting with Jeff, one of the issues that Jeff was concerned about was having certain materials shipped to his mother. And I was trying to find out, why do you want these materials shipped to your mother, and what materials are we talking about? Well, he was talking about anti-evolution materials that he had received from his father, and had confided to me that this is what started him on his journey of faith. This is what started him toward his faith. After his death, when I got to visit with Lionel for about 3 hours in a hotel room, I told him, did you know that Jeff attributed you with the beginning of his faith? And Lionel's jaw just dropped. He couldn't believe that he had never heard that before. He was really touched by that idea. And when we get to the memorial part of it, that's going to be a big part of what Lionel had to say at the memorial service, that he was unaware that he'd had this kind of an influence on his son. But apparently he and Jeff had had debates as the years had gone by over the question of evolution. One of the things Jeff is quoted as saying regarding his crimes is that at the time he was committing his crimes, he believed there was no God. He believed that we were all just a result of evolution, that all of us that existed was nothing more than the product of slime, and there's nothing wrong with killing products of slime. That's pretty much what it came down to. And you can see a certain amount of logic to what he's talking about. If all of us are just evolutionary products of one thing or another, and in the evidence around us in the world we see animals kill other animals and eat other animals, what's the difference between this animal eating another part of another animal too? And so you can see some of what he's coming to. He wasn't trying to justify, he was just trying to explain where he was coming from. But the material that was sent to him was material from Bert Thompson's anti-evolutionary things. I know there's a title of the whole thing, but I don't recall what it was. But this is what he was talking about, was the material that his father had sent him, had caused him to rethink the question of the existence of God. And so then after the, and I'm going to trace it as best as I know as I put the history together, after the Stone Phillips interview of Dateline NBC, where Jeff spent a great deal of time talking about the evil urges that he's wrestled with and so forth, two people, and I looked at my material today, it wasn't Calvin Booth, it was Curtis Booth. Curtis Booth and Mary Mott had seen this, and they sent him Bible correspondence courses from the World Bible School, is what it was, and Bibles. And he received these and accepted them and studied his way through them, and then wrote back, and someone asked me about the date, and I looked up the date. He wrote back on April the 1st to both Mary Mott and to Curtis Booth, please find someone to baptize me. I've asked them here, and they don't know that they know how to do that, or they don't know that anyone to do that. There's a question about bringing a tank in, and these were sort of issues that he was worried about. But please, I want to be baptized. And I think I have up here some of the materials where he actually wrote those things out, and you can see, and his hand, his signature, and so forth, he was really much concerned about that. So April the 1st was when he sent out the request. I received the call on April the 6th, and by the time I finally got to see him and got the baptism done, it was May the 10th. And so I think it was about 3 weeks after April the 6th, about April 24th or something like that, when I finally got to visit him. And then we had another couple of weeks of trying to figure out where do we get this and how do we do this and those sort of things, which I want to kind of relate to you as I continue the story. But right now I'm trying to explain where his faith came from. Why would he receive materials from an unknown source, Curtis Booth and Mary Mott? and reject material he got from other people. There was a woman that came down to me from Marshfield, not a member of the church, but she was upset after Jeff's death, and I had revealed that there were a number of women who contacted me after Jeff's death, that they had been pen pals with Jeff, that they had written letters to him, and he'd written letters back to them. And many of them thought they were in love with Jeff. And so, ironically, after his death, I was contacted by about a half a dozen young women. And some of them felt that they were in love with Jeff and were in grief over Jeff's death and so forth. In fact, I had one ironic situation where there was a woman sitting in my office crying about Jeff's death. I'm getting a call from another woman somewhere across the United States also crying to me about Jeff's death. So I've got two of them sitting here at the same time crying about Jeff's death. Neither one knew about the other. And some of them were kind of angry and jealous that Jeff had other women that he had written to and what's going on here. Well, this woman from Marshall came down and she was angry because she'd written Jeff several times and he'd never answered her letters. And I didn't know the answer. I just simply said, I don't know why he chose to answer some and didn't choose to answer others. I know he received an awful lot of unrequested material from a whole lot of different people, a whole lot of different sources. Why he accepts one and not another, I didn't know. But my best guess as to why he accepted material from Curtis Booth and Mary Mott is that reflected and represented his religious heritage. As I said, when I asked him, what is your background? He said the Church of Christ. And these two people were coming from a Church of Christ angle. And Jeff wanted very much to get back into his faith. So this is what he wanted to do. Now, when his father had sent him this material, the part of the story which I didn't tell you about was that Lionel and Joyce had quit going to church when Jeff was about 4 or 5 years of age. And some said, well, how could he learn about baptism at that time in his life? Well, he didn't at that time in his life. But the younger brother, David, was about 10 years younger than Jeff Wiedomer. And he went to the University of Ohio, which was the alma mater of his father. And while there, he got connected up with a Church of Christ Bible chair. That's an expression we used to use to describe a Church of Christ devotional group that would get together and read the Bible together and study together. And he was converted. He, again, reached back into his own family heritage for a faith, and he was converted and became a member of the church. And so he came to his father and urged his father to go back to church. This occurred in 1989. So Lionel went back to church and began attending a church on the west side of Akron, Ohio, and that's where he still attends to this day as far as I know. And while he was there, when he came back to this church, they were having a Bert Thompson seminar where he was doing an anti-evolution stuff, and this was exactly the sort of stuff that he and Jeff had been arguing about. So he bought all the materials he possibly could and sent them off to Jeff. And it's unclear to me exactly when Jeff started reading these things, but Jeff attributed that to how Jeff's faith got started. So that's how the faith got started. And then, of course, he's arrested. And what do you do when you're in prison? Well, you don't do very much. You sit around an awful lot. And you read a lot because there's nothing else much to do. And so he began reading, and he read a great deal of things. In fact, I've talked to other inmates, especially at Columbia, in Portage, where there was a little bit of an underground black market that occurred after Jeff died. Men who went into the library, found the books Jeff had checked out, would rip out chapters and sell these to people and make some money. And so there were some people that made money off the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer had checked out a book in the library, and so they had some ideas of what he was reading. So you get a little bit of people making money off of this story, and that's part of the thing that bothered Jeff a great deal too. But at any rate, he received these things because they reflected on his heritage, and so he began studying and reading these things. And I already told you he'd read a book by Thomas Warren about baptism that was very convincing to him. Thomas Warren is an author in our brotherhood that was very debate-style oriented character, very good about proving a point and laying a point down, and was such a logical thinker that a lot of people literally lived in fear and dread of ever disagreeing with him. They just felt that anything he said, it had to be right from God to him, to you, and if you disagreed with him, it was tantamount to disagreeing with God. There would come a time later on when people would finally see the error of that way and would not put so much regard into Thomas Warren. But Thomas Warren was a very influential man and carried a great deal of weight. He'd also written to Garland Elkins down in Arkansas, and Garland, of course, is a famous character in the Church of Christ as well, too. And Garland had written him an awful lot of things to encourage him and help him out as well. Now, along with good material. He also got some bad material, which I'll reflect on a little bit later too when we get further into the study of his Christianity. But this is some of the foundation upon which it is based. So he received these correspondence courses, took them, and at the end of them he wrote, "I want to be baptized, please find someone to baptize me." And that's how I entered the picture. So you really have kind of an interesting evangelistic process going on. You have his brother's involvement, you have his father's involvement, and then you have two people who are just out there somewhere who are interested in evangelism, and they on their own send something to Jeff. And so you have these four working together, and by the time I come on the scene, I don't have to spend a lot of time convincing him to be baptized. He's already convinced he wants to be baptized. He just wants to find out if someone will baptize him. So I got the call on April the 6th, and it's from a nervous Rob McRae, and he's telling me, "You better sit down because you're not going to believe this, but there's a prisoner who wants to be baptized, and I can't take care of it. Will you please take care of it?" And my initial reaction was, "Well, yeah, I'll be glad to. I've never gone to a prison before, but if someone wants to be baptized, I will, swim the deepest mountains and climb the highest, swim the deepest ocean and climb the highest mountains to get to them. That's what I'm going to do. So, okay, we'll go to this prison and deal with it. Well, what's the prisoner's name?" He said, "Well, you're not going to believe this. It's Jeffrey Dahmer." Well, I'd heard of Jeffrey Dahmer. Everyone had heard of Jeffrey Dahmer. And Rob said, "I don't know if this is some kind of a practical joke because April Fool's was just a few days earlier. This may be something left over from April Fool's. So you need to call the chaplain and find out if this is true." He said, "I've already tried calling the chaplain, but the chaplain left for the day. So I have to give this to you because I got to go to this conference and I just can't take care of it. Would you take care of it?" Okay, so I went to bed that night wondering, it was a Wednesday night. And I got the call just before I went to Wednesday night services. So I went to Wednesday night, and I think I was leading songs, and I just mentioned we have a prayer requesting, and I mentioned, "Please pray about this request." And I don't know how accurate it is, but I got this request that Jeffrey Dahmer wants to be baptized, and so I'm going to look into it. Please pray for me. And of course, I got kind of a stunned reaction on the part of everyone. This can't be true. This can't be real. What's going on here? But I'm sure he'll let us know what goes on. So the next day I called the chaplain, and a little bit nervous because I'd never called a prison before, and asked to speak to the chaplain. And when I finally got the chaplain on the line, I began kind of stumbling along, explained who I was, and that I got in a call that there was an inmate there that wanted to be baptized. And I tried to explain because I don't know what kind of religion the chaplain has. Turns out he was a Lutheran, but and that's neither here nor there. But I was trying to explain that this prisoner wants to be baptized, and the kind of baptism we're talking about is a full body immersion in water. We're not talking about just a little sprinkling in the face or pouring water on the head. We're talking about a full body immersion. And so we practiced that, and I'd be willing to do that, but I said that the prisoner's name is kind of famous. And about that time, the chaplain interrupts me and says, "Let's cut the red tape. You're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, aren't you?" I said, "Well, yes, I am, as a matter of fact." I was surprised that the chaplain knew about this. He said, "I've already received a letter from him asking me to be baptized. But I didn't know who was going to do this or how we're going to go about doing it and so forth, so I'm really glad if you would take care of this." And I said, "Well, I don't know that I'll be able to take care of it, but I'll be glad to try to work as much as I can because I happen to know there's a minister and a church much closer to the prison than I am." And this was a minister that at that time was in Baraboo, Wisconsin. There was a church in Baraboo that's gone without ministers most of its history. They've actually had a time where they had 3 men serving as multiple ministers, but they all had secular work, but this time they actually had a guy who was full-time minister that was there. And I kind of felt like Boaz in the book of Ruth, this obligation to take Ruth on as the next of kin and marry her is part of the responsibility, but there's someone nearer yet. And so you have this issue about passing the sandal, and I kind of felt like, well, I've got to first of all pass the sandal and see if the guy will do that. So I had to explain to the chaplain, well, either I or this other fellow, his name was also Jeff, will handle this, but we'll take care of it. And he said, well, let me know when you get all figured out. So I called the fellow in Baraboo and explained to him over the phone that I got this request and that I had confirmed from the chaplain that, yes, it was true that Jeffrey Dahmer wanted to be baptized. And I said, since you live within 15 miles of the prison, this is something I think it's only proper that I give you the right to take care of this if you want to. So you can take care of this if you want. If you want, I can take care of it, or we can do it together, whatever you want to do. And I remember his words very vividly. He said, I'll gladly go with you. And I remember kind of chuckling about that. He was just a young guy. It was his very first ministry. He'd just gotten out of preaching school, and so he was quite frightened of the idea of actually going there. And so we decided that let's get together and meet and decide what kind of questions we're going to ask Jeffrey Dahmer before we start this. So we scheduled a meeting, and it turns out that the meeting we scheduled was in conjunction with another meeting. We were going to go to another meeting. It was about church unity some other place, and so we were riding together. And so on the way riding together, we started talking about how we're going to ask these questions about Jeffrey Dahmer. And before I got there, I was very much involved with Wisconsin Christian Youth Camp at that time, directing a session. So he was kind of new to the state, so I said, by the way, I'd like to ask you to work in camp. Would you be willing to come and be a camp counselor or serve in some capacity and so forth? And his answer was, no, I can't do that because we're leaving the state. You're leaving the state? What's going on here? And I began to explore a little bit and found out that he was suffering from what I have learned to call culture shock. Don't know if you realize it, but Wisconsin's a little bit of a different culture than many other states. He had come from New Hampshire, and he just couldn't quite deal with the drinking heritage that you have in the state, and the fact that some Christians really don't have a problem with having a beer or a glass of wine, and don't see that it being inconsistent with their Christianity. And he'd come from a place where lips that touch wine will never touch mine. You know, that kind of was his attitude sort of thing. So he had a real hard time dealing with that. He couldn't comprehend his children growing up in that kind of atmosphere, and so he had decided he was going to leave. Well, when are you going to leave? Well, it turns out he was going to leave before we could even schedule a visit with the prison. So it canceled him out completely, and that bounced it back to me. So the sandal had been passed. So I called back and tried to arrange a date with the chaplain and so forth, and we set up a date for me to come in there. And of course, as I said before, it took a couple of weeks because they had to get my name and my social security number and my birth date, and I don't know, I felt like they needed my blood type and all. I mean, it was just ridiculous kind of stuff they kind of put you through the first time. And then finally had the date set, and so the date arrives, and I finally go up there to visit with Jeffrey Dahmer. And I'd never been to a prison before, so I had to get directions to get there and get some kind of idea what to go and what to expect. I had seen movies about prisons, so I had this kind of perception of what a prison ought to be like, but I had no idea what it was really all about. Someone asked me, well, were you frightened? Were you afraid? Well, I was frightened in the sense that I'd never been to a prison before. And when I got there, I was real impressed with the electric doors. They don't just open the door, you know, they got to buzz you in. And so you come in, and usually there's two double lobbies, so you come in one door, and you can't open the second door until the first door locks behind you. Then they'll buzz the second door. You know, okay, so I get through that, and that's a little bit intimidating, but, you know, no big deal. And I walk up to the desk and explain who I am. And yes, they were expecting me, so I've got to show my driver's license and sign in and this sort of stuff, and put all my metal things away in the locker and go through the metal detector. You know, all that's a little bit unnerving because you're thinking, wow, they're really afraid of anything here. You know, they're afraid of whatever you might have. And so we get through that, and they go through my Bible and make sure I've got no contraband in my Bible and all this sort of stuff. And I'm real impressed with all of that. And then finally the guard comes and he escorts me to a room, or escorts me to and there's a big, large visiting room out there, and I'm anticipating, okay, where you can put me, because I anticipated probably sitting behind some kind of a glass structure and speaking on a telephone, because I'd seen this in movies, you know. And they get me to a little room.